Hello and welcome to the latest edition of the Data Privacy Party installment. Let's get started. Hello guys, welcome again to another edition of the Data Privacy Party installment. I'm your host, Hunter Sunbeck. Kind of going off a little bit to our traditional series. Right now, I wanted to talk about something that came through very recently in the last few weeks. And if you've been sticking with us over that time period, you know that this is something that we've been monitoring closely for. And finally, it's kind of gone through. So me being a resident of the state of Texas, the Texas Consumer Data Privacy Act is something, and specifically called the Texas Data Privacy and Securities Act, is something we've been following pretty closely and are very excited that it finally has happened. The bill, authored initially by Giovanni Capriglione, who House Representative in the Texas House out of I believe District 23, Tarrant County. That's up in Fort Worth, for those of y'all that are familiar with Texas geography. And he's been serving for, I think, around a decade, maybe a little bit longer in the House. And so he's the primary author of the bill that finally came through. House Bill 4 is the legal citation. And so this is an amendment to Title 11 of the Business and Commerce Code. So just adding into the code an additional subsection, section 154 specifically, or sorry, 541, not quite 154, 541. So we're going to go into it a little bit, talk about some of the definitions, relevant parts of it. This is probably stuff you've heard before, because honestly, this follows a lot of other data privacy laws and kind of the structure on what they have laid out with the various definitions, applicability, the need for controls, the need for privacy notice and transparency, enforcement authority, and so on. So we're going to talk about that today. I kind of have the bill back here behind me as well, just kind of as a nice backdrop too. So the House Bill 4, I'll just refer to it as HB 4, House Bill 4 going forward, so I don't have to say the full name of it. This was introduced to the Texas House back in February 16th, I believe, of this year. Yes. So this bill, authored, put out, introduced back on February 16th, and then read for the first time February 23rd in front of the House. And then eventually, like all bills, it kind of makes its way around to the various houses, committees, so they can review, kind of poke holes, see where it needs to be amended, and so on. So ever since then, we've seen just a number of different things kind of transpire. Most of them not super relevant, but the most relevant obviously would be the latest vote by the Senate and the House. So back on April 5th, the House voted 146 to none, with one abstaining from voting to pass the bill and send it on to the Senate. Senate voted 31 to nothing in favor on May 27th. So that sent the bill to Governor Abbott's desk, and where he eventually signed it. So on May 29th, the House and the Senate both officially signed the bill after it was passed through the Senate vote. And then on June 18th, Governor Abbott signed that bill, making it law and to be effective July 1st of 2024, I believe, is the correct date. So a lot of the stuff I'll kind of cover today, for the most part, is very high level for the bill. A lot of stuff just need to know for consumers as well as other organizations, that stuff that a lot of you probably already doing, especially at an organization level. But some other areas may be a little bit foreign, or may be things you need to start looking into doing, so you can be compliant with this. So a couple definitions that are very important, and I'll kind of talk through these, or rather read them off as it says it in the actual law. So personal data is any information, including sensitive data, that is linked or reasonably linked to an identified or identifiable individual. This term includes pseudonymous data, when the data is used by a controller processor in conjunction with additional information that reasonably links the data to an identified or identifiable individual. The term does not include de-identified data or publicly available information. So in short, personal data, information about you that actually describes who you are as a person. For me, first, last name, address, maybe some other more sensitive information like biometrics or geolocation data. That sort of stuff might kind of lead it into, that's collected as personal data. So, in which a lot of that information, and we've talked a little bit about this in our series, a lot of that information, although public, obviously you can go up and look up, my address on Redfin or Zillow or just Google Maps, but the information that you find is not going to link it to me as an individual. It's going to be separated, and so therefore the information, although the address is public, you don't know who lives at that address, and that's true for most of those sites that you use. The next one is sensitive data. So this is a really important one. I know if you've read through some of the other laws, this is going to all sound the same. Personal data revealing racial or ethnic origin, religious beliefs, genetic biometric data, data of a known child, or precise geolocation data. Consumer is an individual who is a resident of this state acting only in an individual or household context. This term does not include an individual acting in a commercial or employment context. So something just to understand and differentiate. Consumer would be you and I, just going about our daily lives, acting in a consumer context. Controller, referenced quite a bit, and we'll talk about some responsibilities of the controller here soon, but this is an individual or other person that alone or jointly with others determines the purpose and means of processing personal data. A dark pattern is something that the California Privacy Rights Act first kind of introduced. And so this is cited in the Texas law, user interface designed or manipulated with the effect of substantially subverting or impairing user autonomy, decision-making, or choice that includes any practice the FTC refers to as a dark pattern. So this has started to become defined more explicitly, both by the FTC as well as other legal citations. We've talked a little bit about dark patterns in our series, and these essentially are just psychological patterns that get created to almost force you to make a specific decision. An easy example of that, a company is going to offer you 10% off your online purchase if you give them your email address. Essentially a dark pattern. You're giving up something in order to get something, a reward sort of thing, and you're punished by not giving it up because you don't get that same benefit. That's a fairly standard basic example, but definitely applies. This next term, you'll kind of hear me talk a little bit about them later on, but I wanted to include it because of that. So a state agency, as defined as a department, commission, board, office, council, authority, or other agency in any branch or state of state government that is created by the Constitution or a statute of this state, including a university system or institution of higher education, defined by Section 61.003 of the Education Code. So these state agencies, we'll talk a little bit later, not too at length, but this is essentially a carve out from this law, just because there's other things already in place. A trade secret is defined as all forms and types of information, including business, scientific, technical, economic, or engineering information, and any formula, design, prototype, pattern, plan, compilation, program, device, program, code, device, method, technique, process, procedure, yada, yada, whether tangible or intangible, and whether or how stored, compiled, or memorialized, or in writing. So this essentially is the crown jewels of what you have: proprietary technology, proprietary information. Sale of personal information is defined as the means of sharing, disclosing, or transferring of personal data for monetary or other valuable considerations by the controller to a third party. Pseudonymized data is any information that cannot be attributed to a specific individual without the use of additional information, provided that the additional information is kept separately and is subject to appropriate technical and organizational measures to ensure the personal data is not attributed to an identified or identifiable individual. We've talked a little bit about pseudonymization. Essentially, you are replacing one value with a pseudonym, replacing one value with another. This is a reversible form of data masking, of hiding data, and is something that is carved out if data is pseudonymized. The bill does carve it out. There is, methods need to be in place to make sure that that data doesn't become identifiable if it ends up in the wrong hands. And lastly, de-identified data means data that cannot reasonably link to an identified or identifiable individual or a device linked to that individual. So the applicability section, 541.02a, paragraph A, lines 1-3, it explains who does this law apply to. So I'll go through a couple of them. There's actually three. Those lines 1 through 3 are going to talk about it. The first one being is any company, that organization, individual that conducts business in the state or produces a product or service consumed by residents of the state. It also processes or engages in the sale of personal data and is not a small business defined by the U.S. Small Business Administration. So you'll notice this bill, unlike some of the others we've seen come through so far, does not include a revenue threshold. So it does not matter how much money your business makes. You have to comply with this law so long as you're not considered a small business, and some of these other not applicable carve-outs that I'll mention here in a second. The other one is that there's not a processing threshold. So a lot of them that we've seen is if you process the data of 100,000 people or more within a calendar year, this applies. Or if you process data of 25,000 people and the sale of that data accounts for over 50% of your revenues annually, those items aren't in this bill. And so if you're an organization or even an individual that processes data of individuals below the thresholds of other states, and you do it in Texas, unfortunately, that same carve out's not going to be available for you. You're going to have to be compliant with this law. It doesn't specify a minimum threshold, so you can be safe to assume, if you process data of one individual, then you offer service in the state for residents of the state, you also process or sell that personal data, you're going to have to be compliant with this law. Whether you'll get targeted or not is a whole nother discussion that we're not going to go into here. A few areas where they carve out, and so these areas do not apply. So we talked a little bit earlier, state agencies. That's why I mentioned the definition of what they are. You can go back earlier if you want to, if you missed it. State agency or political subdivision of Texas. Any financial institution subject to GLBA, Graham-Leach-Bliley. Any entity subjected to HIPAA. So that's as we talked a little bit earlier about what gets carved out, what applies. HIPAA will carve out because of the medical and healthcare aspect of the protections afforded to in that regulation. Nonprofit organizations are carved out of this as well. Any institution of higher education is carved out, likely because of the protections FERPA has currently in place. And then any electric utility, power generation, or retail electricity provider, municipalities offering those services are also going to be carved out. So the consumers' rights section, you'll see these are very similar to what we've seen in the past, section 541.051. So the consumer may exercise their rights at any time by submitting a request to the controller. This can include confirmation if their personal information is being processed or collected, correct any inaccuracies, delete collected personal information, and obtain evidence that it has been deleted, obtain a copy of their personal information, opt out of the processing of their data for the purposes of targeted advertising, the sale of PI, or just processing for profiling. And profiling would be building kind of a dossier on somebody, collecting information about me so that they know where I live, what are some of the things I enjoy doing with my free time, like making this podcast, what are the things I like learning about, what's my job, those sort of things. So the controller's response to consumer requests is in section 541.502. And this is something we alluded to a little bit earlier. So this is some of the requirements for a controller. They would need to respond without undue delay within 45 days of receiving a consumer's request for some of those things we just talked about. If they are unable to meet that deadline, they can request an extension of 45 days. This needs to be communicated to the consumer, and they need to provide evidence of why they need that. They can't just be because we didn't want to do it in 45 days. There needs to be kind of a reason behind that, and part of that is, if the request from the consumer is very excessive or requires a lot of work, they can find and get that sort of exception and go 45 days longer. If the controller declines to take action, they need to inform the consumer with why that happened and give them the opportunity to appeal the controller's decision. Information is to be provided free of charge twice annually. After that, they can begin charging consumers if it's necessary, just depending on the breadth and the detailed nature of the requests. And the fee needs to not be excessive, obviously in proportion to what the request is from a consumer. So section 541.503, immediately following, is an area, and I encourage everyone that this is a very high level. If you want to, learn a little bit more about it and read through it, you can find the bill at the Texas legislature's website, and then just Google House Bill 4 or search House Bill 4. It'll come right up. But 554.503 is a requirement where the controller must establish an appeal process for consumers and also establish methods to submit consumer requests later on in section 541.055. So that would essentially, the easiest thing to do there is provide an online portal and also include contact information for how to submit requests, whether it's on the phone, you can mail them in. Online portal is the easiest one, just because using the internet is so much faster than trying to go through the post office or on the phone. So jumping into the next section, 541.101 would be the area around controllers' duties of transparency. And so this is, we're only going to hit on a few small ones, but essentially they need to limit the collection of personal information to what is relevant to the processing purpose. So stating that purpose, we'll talk about a privacy notice here in a second. But that purpose, they need to limit collection based on what it is they're actually collecting for. What's the reason behind processing and collecting? The next one, and this is where kind of myself and other privacy professionals, especially on the technical side, come into play, is that they need to establish administrative, physical, and technical safeguards to protect the confidentiality, integrity, and accessibility of personal information. So some standard areas around here, you can implementing various cybersecurity controls and privacy controls on the technical side of things, whether basically encryption, logging and monitoring, conducting annual audits over different privacy areas that you're doing, physical controls like badge readers, security guard, lock screens on your computer. There's a whole number of different common security controls that can be put in place that a lot of organizations probably doing, just not with the privacy in mind, more so from a security standpoint. And so now that a lot of that has kind of come into play for most organizations, the privacy aspect is kind of the next one. Securing what's in the database at the field level and at the data level, and also implementing more data governance practices. Who's responsible for updating? How is it going to be updated? Who approves those updates? Is there any testing that's needed? Kind of general, starting obviously general IT controls, and then kind of branching into some more specific ones just based on different contexts and situations. Section 541.102 is around the privacy notice I alluded to earlier. So these are the items that a privacy notice absolutely needs to have, and it needs to be online where consumers can access. It would include the categories of personal information being processed, what's getting collected, and why is it getting collected, because the next one is about purpose of that processing. So what's getting collected, why, what's getting processed, for what reason, including how consumers may exercise their rights, including links to, that portal we talked about earlier. Great spot to put that. And if there's information being shared with third parties, you also need to include the categories of those third parties whom data is shared. And this kind of category information can almost be determined by the organization itself. There's not a whole lot of copy right now explaining what are the different categories. Obviously breaking it down within industry type as well as what they're doing with that information. Also the categories of personal information that is getting shared. So you essentially can just take what we said in that first one and then use that into, okay, what of these categories is getting shared with third parties? Let's go ahead and add those in. This is getting shared. If you're engaging in the sale of personal information, the controller must include kind of a message, and this is called out specifically in 102. We may sell your sensitive personal data, blah, blah, blah. Same thing, just replace sensitive with biometric if you're selling biometric data to a third party. Lastly, we already hinted at this earlier, the notice must be accessible. Put it on the website somewhere where customers can easily go to find it. Add in a link to where your portal is to allow them to exercise their rights and include those things that we just talked about. The next section, 541.104, talks about the duties of processors. So in summary, processors support the controller in processing activities is what they're there for. They adhere to the instructions of the controller and assist the controller in meeting the obligations of the law. They will assist in providing information when data protection impact assessments occur. And a contract between the controller and processor must include the clear instruction of what the processing is, nature of the processing, and the purpose, the type of data subject that is, we're collecting data on, we're processing, duration of this processing and how long it's needing to occur, the rights and obligations of both of the parties. This would be the controller and the processor. And then the requirements that the processor shall do these three things. Each processor is subject to a duty of confidentiality. This is just we shouldn't need to put this in a law for it to be required in a contract. That should kind of be a given. The next one being delete or return all personal information upon consumer request. So fulfilling what we talked about earlier with consumer rights to delete and obtain, complying with that, and also making information available to the controller. So their job, support the controller and the processing activities. So we just talked a little, I just shared or said the term data protection impact assessment. I'll kind of modify that to DPIA going forward. But section 541.105 talks about a DPIA and some of the requirements that go into that. So we've seen this at a number of different laws, including GDPR actually in Europe, calling for data protection impact assessments. You can kind of think of this as a risk assessment, although it's a little bit different. It's not calling out different risks to areas. We're also looking at benefits as well. But this is conducted by a controller for each and every processing activity that is involved in the collection and processing and storage of personal information, especially when it's for targeted advertising, sale of personal information, processing for the purposes of profiling. If there's a foreseeable risk of unfair, deceptive treatment, any financial, physical, reputational injury. We kind of talked about those, Callow's harm dimensions. And if there's a physical or some intrusion into solitude or seclusion, this comes right out of the book. It sounds like in the private affairs of customers, if intrusion would be offensive to a reasonable person. Two other areas is if there's sensitive data being processed. We talked about what sensitive data is earlier. and any processing activities that present a risk of heightened harm to any consumer. So part of the DPIA is it actually identifies what are those heightened harms that could potentially happen. It also weighs, so this is where kind of a risk assessment falls a little bit short. The DPIA includes what is going to benefit the consumer. So it takes kind of an approach where we look at the benefits and the risks, and then we weigh them against each other and see which one is greater. And this is all includes, you can include indirect benefits. It's kind of difficult to, quantify or really write those down, just because that would be something that's a little bit beyond the purpose of the processing. So it's easy to know what the direct benefit is if we have to collect your information so you can receive 10% off. That's an obvious, this is what you're benefiting. And then the risk is you give up your information to the company, and then if they don't have adequate security controls over protecting your email address, then the risk is of that your email gets leaked, and then you get, unsolicited messages to your email address. It could get used in the creation of an account, potentially stolen email address. The risks can kind of continue on. But when you start to look into the indirect benefits, then we may get a little more gray area and a little more subjective. The objective one being you receive 10% off, but the subjective, you're happy with the product. I don't know. You may not be happy with the product, even though you receive 10% off. I personally think 10% off is a piece of garbage sort of discount, because you're essentially saving tax, and then they just apply tax and potentially shipping right back to it. And you end up not saving anything, in my opinion. But that's just my opinion on it. So I usually avoid those. But kudos to those of you that don't. The DPIA must be made available to the Attorney General. So we'll talk about enforcement here in a second. But also the DPIA should always be confidential and exempt from public inspection, unless you're directly involved with the company conducting it, or the organization itself, or you're the Attorney General. The Attorney General's office, you do not have access to that DPIA. That would be considered under the trade secret definition in a way, and something that should be kept confidential and not leaked to the public. A single DPIA may address several processing operations that include similar activities as well. So you don't have to do one for every single activity if you're able to lump some of those together. And there's also no need for a retroactive DPIA at all. So I mentioned July 1st, 2024 is when this goes into effect. This would be for any processing activity that happens after that date. This is not any processing activity that occurs prior to that date. So we're not going to have to do 5,000 DPIAs retroactively just so we can bring ourselves into compliance. No. It takes effect July 1st, 2024, and that's when that DPIA clause is going to be coming into effect as well. So everything that happens after the cutoff date. Enforcement authority, this can be found in section 541.151. The Attorney General has the exclusive enforcement authority. And matter of fact, a few sections later, it even talks about the fact there's no private right of action. So this means, and you can kind of see this in GDPR kind of has something like this, but most of these state laws don't have this. The Attorney General's office is the only one that can take action against an organization. Now, obviously, you and I can bring to their attention something that's happening. However, we can't take legal action citing this specific law as our case against an organization. The Attorney General is the one that has exclusive authority over enforcing what we just spent the last 15-20 minutes talking about. A few sections later, we're kind of getting close to the end of this high level one, so thanks for sticking with me, y'all. This is a notice of violation opportunity to cure. So section 541.154 is around when does a company need to get notified of a violation having occurred, and this notification comes from the Attorney General. And then how long do they have until they actually get hit? So the first one being a notification a penalty's coming, and then the next one being the penalty. So the gap between that is going to be 30 days. And an organization has, if they cure the violation within that 30-day period, then there is no penalty that's going to be levied against them. Obviously, they need to show evidence to support that it's been cured. All parties affected are all on good terms. Supporting documentation shows that it's been cured before that 30-day mark, and they avoid the fine. For civil penalties, this is stated in section 541.155. Every single violation is going to be $7,500 with no limit per how much can be levied against an organization. And I mentioned this earlier, so this is the exact reference as far as there's no private right of action. This is actually explicitly called out in 541.156. And lastly, I mentioned this earlier, but I want to end with it. The effective date, July 1st, 2024. House Bill 4 will officially take effect. We've already seen a couple states like Virginia, California, have all had theirs come into effect this year. Matter of fact, there should be Colorado and Connecticut both went into effect 2 days ago as of recording this podcast, July 1st, 2023. So we're starting to see these state laws come into effect, start to take shape, start to take root. Processing activities need to be looked at. DPIA is done. Let me say this too about it. I think a lot of what's in there is stuff that most organizations, from my experience, are already doing and already taking care of. But there might be a few small items where maybe we need to add into our online privacy notice, the portal. We need to generate a portal. We need to take a look at what data we have. Do we have a data governance policy in place? Do we have a data privacy policy in place? What are we doing to protect that information that gets called out? And so that information being, and you can go back to the beginning of this podcast, we kind of talk about some definitions of what that is. You can kind of think of it as anything that may lead you to identify an individual, then chances are that's probably going to be considered personal information in the eyes of the law. That's all I had today, y'all. So I wanted a good update on that. So I'm very happy to get that done and get that out there for everybody. If you have any questions or anything, please feel free to reach out to me. You can find me on LinkedIn, Twitter as well, or just go to our website at dataprivacyparty.com. Thanks. Thanks for listening to the latest edition of the Data Privacy Party install. Hope you learned something new and can better protect your information. Like us on YouTube, Apple Podcasts, and Spotify, and subscribe to hear more great content.